The year was 1885, and the small town of Cedar Ridge sat like a dusty speck on the vast canvas of the American frontier. With barely 300 souls calling it home, everyone knew everyone else's business. The main street stretched just 4 blocks, lined with weathered wooden buildings that had seen better days. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a small church made up the heart of this remote settlement. At the edge of town, in a narrow building squeezed between the baker's shop and an empty lot, lived a woman who had become the subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Her name was Li Mei, though most folks in Cedar Ridge simply called her the Chinese woman when they bothered to acknowledge her at all. Li Mei had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 years earlier, carrying little more than a worn leather satchel filled with mysterious herbs and a heart heavy with hope. She had traveled from San Francisco, where life had become increasingly difficult for people like her. The Chinese Exclusion Act had made it clear that folks from her homeland weren't particularly welcome in America, but Li Mei had nowhere else to go. Her husband had died in a mining accident 2 years prior, leaving her alone in a foreign land with nothing but her knowledge of traditional remedies, passed down through generations of women in her family. Despite the cold reception from most townspeople, Li Mei had managed to carve out a small living for herself. She worked as a seamstress, her nimble fingers creating beautiful alterations and repairs for the women of Cedar Ridge, but it was her other skill that truly set her apart and made some people uncomfortable. Li Mei knew the ancient art of herbal medicine, something her grandmother had taught her back in China. Her small shop smelled of dried ginger, strange roots, and herbs that most people couldn't even pronounce. Glass jars lined the shelves, filled with powders and leaves that looked nothing like the medicine sold at the general store. To Li Mei, these were treasures more valuable than gold. To many in Cedar Ridge, they were evidence of something dark and foreign. The trouble began on a particularly hot Tuesday morning in late summer. 8-year-old Timothy Sullivan, the son of the town's most prominent merchant, had been suffering from stomach pains for several days. His mother, Catherine, had tried everything she knew. She gave him warm milk, made him rest, even had the local doctor examine him. But nothing seemed to help, and the boy's condition was getting worse. In desperation, Catherine remembered hearing other women talk about the Chinese woman's remedies. Some said she had helped old Mrs. Patterson with her arthritis. Others whispered that she had cured young Billy Thompson's persistent cough when nothing else would work. Against her better judgment and her husband's wishes, Catherine decided to pay Li Mei a visit. The bell above Li Mei's door chimed softly as Catherine entered the small shop with Timothy in tow. The boy looked pale and weak, his usual energetic spirit dampened by days of discomfort. Li Mei looked up from her sewing and immediately noticed the child's condition. Her kind eyes filled with concern as she set aside her work. Catherine explained Timothy's symptoms in a hesitant voice, clearly uncomfortable but driven by a mother's desperation. Li Mei listened carefully, asking gentle questions about what the boy had eaten and how long he had been sick. She examined Timothy's tongue and felt his forehead, her touch as gentle as any mother's. After a few minutes of consideration, Li Mei disappeared into the back room of her shop. She returned with a small paper packet containing a brownish powder that smelled of earth and distant spices. Through a mixture of broken English and hand gestures, she explained that Timothy should drink this mixed with warm water 3 times a day. She demonstrated how to prepare it, her movements careful and precise. Catherine paid the requested 50 cents and hurried home with the remedy, feeling both hopeful and anxious about what she had just done. She prepared the medicine exactly as Li Mei had shown her and gave it to Timothy that afternoon. For the first day, nothing seemed to change. Timothy remained listless and complained of the same stomach pains. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of getting better, the boy's condition took a turn for the worse. By the second day, Timothy was running a high fever and could barely keep water down. His parents were beside themselves with worry. Dr. Harrison, the town's only physician, was called immediately. A stern man with graying whiskers and little patience for what he called foreign nonsense, Dr. Harrison examined Timothy and immediately demanded to know what treatments the boy had received. When Catherine reluctantly mentioned Li Mei's remedy, the doctor's face darkened with anger. "You gave him what?" Dr. Harrison's voice boomed through the Sullivan household. "That woman is practicing medicine without any training or license. These foreign concoctions could contain anything. She could have poisoned your son." Word of Dr. Harrison's accusation spread through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire in dry grass. By evening, half the town knew that Timothy Sullivan was deathly ill after taking medicine from the Chinese woman. By the next morning, the story had grown and twisted like a weed. Some said Li Mei had deliberately poisoned the boy. Others whispered that she was practicing dark magic disguised as medicine. The truth was that Timothy had contracted a fever that had nothing to do with Li Mei's herbs. Such illnesses were common in frontier towns where sanitation was poor and medical knowledge was limited. But fear and prejudice have a way of clouding people's judgment, especially when they're looking for someone to blame. A group of angry townspeople gathered outside the saloon on the third day of Timothy's illness. Led by his father, Patrick Sullivan, they spoke in heated tones about the danger of allowing foreign witchcraft to continue in their community. The conversation grew more heated as more people joined in, each adding their own fears and suspicions about Li Mei. "I always knew there was something unnatural about that woman," declared Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife. "The way she talks to herself in that strange language. And those jars full of mysterious powders, it's not Christian, I tell you. My wife went to her once for a headache remedy," added Tom Bradley, the blacksmith. "She mixed up some foul-smelling tea that made her sick for 2 days. We should have run her out of town then." Sheriff Daniel Foster found himself in an impossible position. A former soldier who had seen his share of injustice, he knew that mob justice was a dangerous thing. But he also knew that public sentiment was turning ugly, and his job was to keep the peace. When the crowd outside the saloon began to grow, and their voices became more threatening, he knew he had to act. The sheriff's knock on Li Mei's door came. Just as the sun was setting on what would be her last day of freedom, she opened the door, to find Foster standing there with a grim expression, his hand resting on his holster. Behind him, she could see a crowd of angry faces illuminated by torchlight. "Ma'am," Sheriff Foster said quietly, his voice heavy with reluctance, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. There are some serious accusations being made, and for your own safety, I think it's best if you're in protective custody until we can sort this out." Li Mei didn't fully understand all the English words, but she understood the tone and the situation well enough. She had seen this kind of anger before, in other towns where people like her weren't welcome. Without protest, she gathered her shawl and followed Sheriff Foster into the growing darkness, leaving behind the small life she had tried so hard to build in Cedar Ridge. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge as word spread that a trial would be held. Sheriff Foster had spent a sleepless night in his office, watching over Li Mei, who sat quietly in the single jail cell, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying. The sheriff had seen enough frontier justice in his time to know that what was about to happen wouldn't be justice at all. By 9 o'clock, nearly the entire town had gathered inside Murphy's saloon, the only building large enough to hold such a crowd. The regular tables and chairs had been pushed aside to make room for makeshift benches. At the front of the room, behind the bar that usually served whiskey and beer, sat Judge William Crawford. He was a traveling circuit judge who happened to be passing through Cedar Ridge on his monthly rounds, and his arrival couldn't have been more poorly timed. Judge Crawford was not a bad man, but he was a practical one. He had learned long ago that in small frontier towns, keeping the peace sometimes meant giving people what they wanted to hear. At 62 years old, with thinning gray hair and tired eyes, he had presided over hundreds of cases in dozens of towns just like Cedar Ridge. He understood that his job wasn't just about law and order. It was about preventing angry mobs from taking matters into their own hands. Li Mei was brought into the saloon with her hands bound behind her back, though Sheriff Foster had insisted the ropes be loose enough not to hurt her. She looked small and frightened as she was led to a wooden chair that served as the defendant's seat. Her dark eyes scanned the crowd of hostile faces, searching for even one person who might look at her with kindness. She found none. The crowd fell silent as Judge Crawford banged his gavel on the bar. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. "This court is now in session," he announced in a voice that commanded attention. "We're here to address the charges against Lee May, accused of attempting to murder young Timothy Sullivan through the use of dangerous foreign substances." Dr. Harrison was called as the first witness. He stood up from his seat in the front row, adjusting his vest and clearing his throat importantly. The doctor had always enjoyed being the center of attention, and today was no different. He walked to the front of the room with the confidence of a man who believed himself to be the smartest person in any room he entered. "Your Honor," Dr. Harrison began, his voice carrying to every corner of the saloon, "I have been practicing medicine in this territory for over 15 years. In all that time, I have never seen a case quite like young Timothy Sullivan's. The boy was perfectly healthy until his mother, God forgive her desperation, sought treatment from this woman." He pointed a dramatic finger at Lee May, who shrank back in her chair. Within hours of consuming her foreign concoction, the child became violently ill. His fever spiked to dangerous levels, and he began experiencing severe digestive distress. In my professional opinion, this woman deliberately poisoned that innocent boy with substances unknown to civilized medicine. The crowd murmured angrily. At these words, several men stood up, their faces red with rage, until Judge Crawford banged his gavel again. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" Patrick Sullivan, Timothy's father, was called next. A successful merchant who owned the largest store in town, Patrick carried himself with the authority of a man used to being respected. His normally neat appearance was disheveled, his hair uncombed, and his shirt wrinkled from days of worry about his son. "That woman nearly killed my boy," Patrick said, his voice shaking with emotion. "My wife went to her out of desperation, and look what happened. Timothy has been sick for 5 days now, burning up with fever, barely able to keep down water. Dr. Harrison says it's touch and go whether he'll survive." He turned to face Lee May directly, his eyes blazing with pain and anger. "She gave him some kind of poison disguised as medicine. What kind of person does that to a child? What kind of evil lives in someone's heart that they would hurt an innocent little boy?" Lee May tried to stand up, to explain that she had only wanted to help, that her herbs were meant to heal, not harm. But her English was limited, and the words came out broken and confused. No poison. Good medicine." "Help boy! I help boy!" she said desperately, but her thick accent made her words difficult to understand, and the crowd's angry murmurs drowned out her voice. Judge Crawford banged his gavel again. "The defendant will remain seated and silent unless specifically asked to speak," he ordered. Catherine Sullivan, Timothy's mother, was the next to testify. She looked pale and exhausted, her eyes red from crying. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and people in the back of the room leaned forward to hear her words. "I know I shouldn't have gone to her," Catherine said, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My husband told me not to, but I was so worried about Timothy. He'd been sick for days, and nothing was helping. I heard other women talking about how she'd helped their families, so I thought maybe she could help my boy too." Her voice broke as she continued, "But look what happened. My poor Timothy is fighting for his life because of my foolish decision. I should have trusted Dr. Harrison from the beginning. I should never have let that woman near my child." The crowd's anger was growing more intense with each testimony. Men began calling out for immediate justice, their voices creating a frightening chorus that filled the saloon. "Hang her!" someone shouted from the back. "She tried to murder a child!" yelled another. Judge Crawford knew he was losing control of the situation. He could see the bloodlust in the crowd's eyes, the same look he'd seen in too many frontier towns when people decided that the law was moving too slowly for their taste. He had to do something before this turned into a lynching. "Mrs. Patterson, please come forward," the judge called out. hoping to hear from someone who might have had a positive experience with Li Mei's treatments. Old Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 70s who suffered from painful arthritis, shuffled to the front of the room. The crowd expected her to defend Li Mei, since everyone knew the Chinese woman had treated her joint pain. But Mrs. Patterson surprised everyone with her testimony. "Well, Your Honor," she said in her creaky voice, "it's true that woman gave me something for my aching hands. But now that I think about it, those herbs she used were probably some kind of devil's magic. How else would a foreign woman know things that our own doctors don't? It ain't natural, I tell you. It ain't Christian." The crowd erupted in approval at these words. Even Li Mei's one potential supporter had turned against her, swayed by the fear and suspicion that had taken hold of the entire town. Judge Crawford called for order again, but his heart was sinking. He could see which way this was going, and he knew that any attempt to be fair or reasonable would likely result in the crowd taking justice into their own hands. In frontier towns, judges who went too strongly against public opinion sometimes found themselves facing angry mobs as well. When it came time for Li Mei to defend herself, she stood up slowly, her legs shaking with fear. She looked around the
room at all the hostile faces staring back at her and tried to find the English words to explain that she had never wanted to hurt anyone.
That helping people was all she had ever tried to do. "I know hurt boy," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crowd's angry murmurs. "Medicine good, help people. I help many people, boy sick before, not from medicine, I try help." But her broken English and foreign accent only made the crowd more suspicious. To them, her words sounded like the mumbling of someone trying to cover up her crimes with lies and excuses. "She can't even speak proper English," someone shouted. "How can we trust anything she says?" Judge Crawford had heard enough. The pressure from the crowd was becoming unbearable, and he could see that tempers were reaching a dangerous boiling point. He knew that if he didn't give the people what they wanted, they might take matters into their own hands. And that would be far worse than what he was about to do. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he announced, addressing the 12 men who had been hastily selected that morning, "you have heard the evidence. A child lies near death after consuming substances provided by the defendant. The town's respected physician has testified that these foreign concoctions nearly killed young Timothy Sullivan. I ask you to consider your verdict." The jury didn't even leave the room. They huddled together for less than 5 minutes, whispering among themselves while the crowd watched impatiently. When they straightened up, their foreman, a local rancher named Pete Williams, stood to deliver their decision. "We find the defendant guilty of attempted murder," he announced. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Li Mei collapsed back into her chair, not fully understanding the English words, but clearly comprehending their meaning from the crowd's reaction. Judge Crawford banged his gavel one final time. "Li Mei, you have been found guilty of attempted murder through the use of dangerous foreign substances. The sentence of this court is death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow." The words hit Li Mei like a physical blow. She understood enough English to know that they were going to kill her, and she finally broke down, sobbing quietly into her hands while the crowd celebrated what they believed was justice being served. 20 miles outside of Cedar Ridge, the news of Li Mei's death sentence reached Thomas McKenna just as he was finishing his evening chores. The sun was setting behind the rolling hills that surrounded his ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But the words his ranch hand Bobby had just spoken made the peaceful evening feel heavy with dread. "They're gonna hang her at dawn, Mr. McKenna," Bobby said, still breathing hard from his fast ride from town. "That Chinese lady," Judge said she tried to poison the Sullivan boy with some kind of foreign magic. Thomas set down the bucket of feed he'd been carrying and stared at Bobby in disbelief. At 45 years old, Thomas had seen enough of life to know that fear could make good people do terrible things. But this news hit him like a punch to the stomach. He knew Li Mei not well, but well enough to know that she was no murderer. 3. Months earlier, when one of his Chinese workers named Chun had fallen sick with a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, Thomas had taken him to see Li Mei. Dr. Harrison had been out of town, and Chen was getting worse by the day. Li Mei had mixed up some herbs that smelled terrible but worked like magic. Within a week, Chen was back to work, healthy as ever. The woman was a healer, not a killer. "Are you sure about this, Bobby?" Thomas asked, hoping there had been some mistake. "Are you absolutely certain that's what happened?" Bobby nodded grimly. "Saw it myself, boss. The whole town was therein. Murphy's saloon. That judge didn't waste any time. Said she was guilty of attempted murder and sentenced her to hang first thing tomorrow morning." Folks were cheering like it was some kind of celebration. Thomas felt sick to his stomach. He'd fought in the Civil War and had seen men die for noble causes, but this wasn't noble. This was fear and hatred disguised as justice. He thought about Chun and the other Chinese workers who had labored on his ranch over the years. They were good men, hardworking and honest, who sent most of their earnings back to their families in China. They didn't deserve the suspicion and hatred that seemed to follow them wherever they went. "Bobby, saddle up my horse," Thomas said suddenly, his mind made up. "I'm riding into town?" "Boss, it's getting dark and there ain't nothing you can do now," Bobby protested. "The whole town's made up their minds. They want that woman dead, and anybody who speaks up for her is gonna make enemies fast." Thomas understood Bobby's concern, but he couldn't just sit on his ranch and do nothing while an innocent woman was murdered by a mob. His late wife Helen had always said that a man's character was measured by what he did when no one was watching, when it was easier to just look the other way. Tonight would be the ultimate test of that principle. "I appreciate your concern, Bobby, but I can't live with myself if I don't at least try," Thomas said, walking toward the barn. "Sometimes a man has to do what's right, even when it's not popular." The ride to Cedar Ridge took Thomas just over an hour, and with every mile he felt his determination growing stronger. He thought about the war, about the friends he'd lost fighting for principles they believed in. He thought about Helen, who had died of fever 2 years ago, and how she would have reacted to news of this injustice. She would have been the first one to speak up. Consequences be damned. When Thomas reached the edge of town, he could see that Cedar Ridge was still very much awake despite the late hour. Lanterns glowed in windows, and groups of men stood talking on street corners. The excitement of the day's events had the whole town buzzing with energy. Some folks were already talking about making the hanging into a public spectacle, a warning to any other foreigners who might think about settling in their community. Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office and took a deep breath before walking inside. Sheriff Foster looked up from his desk with surprise when he saw who had entered. The two men knew each other well enough, though they'd never been particularly close friends. "Thomas, what brings you to town this late?" Foster asked, though his tired expression suggested he already suspected why the rancher was there. "I heard about what happened today, Daniel," Thomas said, using the sheriff's first name to remind him they were speaking as equals, not as strangers. "I came to see if there's anything that can be done to stop this madness." Sheriff Foster leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single day. "Thomas, I wish there was something I could do, but the judge has made his decision. The whole town is behind it. If I try to interfere now, they'll just take matters into their own hands, and that'll be worse for everyone. You and I both know this isn't justice, Daniel," Thomas said quietly. "This is a lynching with legal paperwork attached to it. That woman no more tried to murder Timothy Sullivan than you or I did." The sheriff's office was quiet except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. In the back room, Thomas could hear Li Mei moving around in her cell, probably unable to sleep knowing what awaited her at dawn. "You think I don't know that?" Foster said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think I'm happy about any of this? But what choice do I have? If I don't carry out this execution, they'll form a lynch mob and do it themselves. At least this way, it'll be quick and clean." Thomas shook his head. "There's always a choice, Daniel." Maybe not a good choice, but there's always a choice. He walked over to the door that led to the jail cells and called out softly, "Miss Lee." "May, can you hear me?" A moment later, Lee May appeared at the small barred window of her cell. Her face was streaked with tears, and her eyes were red from crying, but she looked at Thomas with curiosity rather than fear. She recognized him as one of the few people in the area who had ever treated her with basic human decency. "Mr. Thomas," she said quietly, her English heavily accented but understandable. "Why you come here?" "I came because what's happening to—" "He was wrong," Thomas replied. "I know you didn't try to hurt that boy. I know you were trying to help him." Lee May's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Boy very sick before medicine. I try help. I only try help. Always help people. Never hurt." Thomas turned back to Sheriff Foster, who had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort. "See, Daniel? Does that sound like a woman who tried to murder a child?" "Thomas, it doesn't matter what I think," Foster said, standing up from his desk. "The judge made his ruling, the jury reached their verdict, and the sentence will be carried. Out at dawn, that's the law." "That's not law, that's mob rule," Thomas shot back, his voice rising slightly. "And you know it as well as I do." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and Thomas could see the conflict playing out in the sheriff's eyes. Foster was a decent man caught in an impossible situation, torn between his duty to uphold the law and his knowledge that a terrible injustice was about to be committed. "Even if I wanted to help," Foster said eventually, "what could I do? The whole town expects to see that woman hang tomorrow morning. If she suddenly disappears, they'll blame me, and then we'll have an even bigger problem on our hands." Thomas had been thinking about this during his ride to town, and he had an idea that was dangerous but might just work. What if she didn't disappear? He said carefully, "What if something happened that made it impossible to carry out the execution, something that wasn't your fault?" Sheriff Foster looked at Thomas with suspicion. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about giving an innocent woman a chance to live," Thomas replied. "I'm talking about doing the right thing, even when it's not the easy thing." The sheriff was quiet for a long time, staring at the floor and wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he looked up at Thomas with tired eyes. "I didn't hear any of this conversation," he said slowly. "And if something were to happen tonight that prevented me from carrying out tomorrow's execution, well, I suppose that would be out of my control?" Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. What he was planning would make him an outlaw in the eyes of Cedar Ridge, and there would be no going back once he set things in motion. But sometimes a man had to risk everything to save an innocent life. "Daniel, I need you to know that whatever happens tonight, you're a good man caught in a bad situation," Thomas said. "And I want you to know that I'll take full responsibility for my actions." Sheriff Foster nodded slowly, understanding what Thomas was really saying. "I make my evening rounds in about an hour," he said quietly. "Sometimes I stop by Murphy's saloon for a drink before heading home. Sometimes that drink turns into several drinks, and I don't get back to check on the jail until very late." Thomas extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Sheriff Foster shook it. Both men knew they were crossing a line that they could never uncross, but both men also knew that sometimes crossing that line was the only way to live with yourself. The clock on the sheriff's office wall struck midnight as Thomas crouched in the shadows behind the building, his heart pounding so loud he was sure someone would hear it. He had spent the last 3 hours carefully planning every detail of what he was about to do, but now that the moment had arrived, doubt crept into his mind like cold fog. One wrong move, one unexpected sound, and his plan would crumble. Taking Lee May's last hope with it, Sheriff Foster had kept his word. About an hour earlier, Thomas had watched from his hiding spot as the sheriff locked up the office and headed toward Murphy's saloon. Foster walked with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who wanted to be seen by as many people as possible, establishing his presence at the saloon so no one could later claim he had been involved in whatever might happen at the jail. Thomas knew he had maybe 2 hours before Foster would return, probably stumbling a bit and making enough noise to wake anyone who might be sleeping nearby. It would be the perfect cover story, The sheriff had been drinking, and hadn't noticed anything unusual when he came back to check on his prisoner. The back door of the sheriff's office was secured with a simple wooden bar that could be lifted from the outside if you knew the trick. Thomas had learned this detail years ago when he and Foster had been younger men, back when they occasionally shared a drink and swapped stories about their experiences in the war. It was funny how a casual piece of information shared between friends could become so important years later, moving as quietly as a cat stalking its prey. Thomas lifted the wooden bar and eased the door open. The hinges creaked softly, a sound that seemed as loud as thunder in the quiet night air. He froze, listening for any sign that someone had heard, but the town remained peaceful around him. Inside the office, a single oil lamp burned low on the sheriff's desk, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The keys to the jail cell hung on a peg beside the door, exactly where Thomas had remembered seeing them. He grabbed them carefully, making sure they didn't jangle against each other. Leah May was sitting on the narrow cot in her cell, her back against the wall and her knees drawn up to her chest. She wasn't sleeping. How could anyone sleep on the night before their execution? When she heard footsteps approaching, she looked up with fear in her eyes, probably expecting to see someone coming to torment her in her final hours. "Miss Lee May?" Thomas whispered urgently. "It's me, Thomas McKenna." "I'm here to help you." Her eyes widened with surprise and confusion. "Mr. Thomas, what you do here, very dangerous for you." "We don't have much time to explain," Thomas said, fumbling with the keys until he found the right one. "I'm getting you out of here. We have to leave town right now, before anyone realizes you're gone." The cell door swung open with a soft squeak, and Lee May stood up slowly, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. "But where we go, they find me. They hang me anyway." "Not if I can help it," Thomas replied, though he knew she was probably right. Once the town discovered she was gone, they would form search parties and scour the countryside looking for her. But at least this way, she had a fighting chance instead of certain death. Lee May gathered her few possessions, a small bundle of clothes and the leather satchel containing her precious herbs. As they prepared to leave, Thomas pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil from the sheriff's desk. By the flickering light of the oil lamp, he quickly wrote a message that would ensure no one else would be blamed for what he was about to do. "To the people of Cedar Ridge," he wrote in his careful handwriting, "I have taken Lee May from this jail because I believe she is innocent of the charges against her. I take full responsibility for this action. No one else in this town is to blame. If you want justice, come find me at my ranch, Thomas McKenna." He left the note on the sheriff's desk where it would be easily found, then led Lee May toward the back door. "Stay close to me and don't make any noise," he whispered. "My horse is tied up behind the general store. We'll have to move fast once we get outside." The night air felt cool against their faces as they slipped out of the jail and into the darkness. Thomas had chosen this route carefully. The back alleys of Cedar Ridge were less likely to have people wandering around at midnight, and they could reach his horse without passing too many windows where someone might spot them. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every small sound made them freeze in terror. A cat knocked over a tin can near the blacksmith shop, and both Thomas and Lee May nearly jumped out of their skin. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and they crouched behind a water barrel until the sound stopped, hearts racing with fear that they had been discovered. When they finally reached Thomas's horse, he helped Lee May climb up behind him, then carefully guided the animal away from town at a slow walk. He desperately wanted to break into a gallop and put as much distance as possible between them and Cedar Ridge, but he knew the sound of running hooves would wake half the town and bring pursuit much sooner than he wanted, only when they were a full mile outside of town did Thomas allow his horse to pick up speed. Lee May clung to his back as they rode through the darkness, following paths that Thomas knew by heart from years of traveling between his ranch and town. The moon was nearly full, providing just enough light to see the trail ahead, but also making them visible to anyone who might be following. "Mr. Thomas," Lee May called out over the sound of hoofbeats, "why you help me? You not know me good. This very dangerous for you." Thomas thought about her question as they rode through the night. Why was he risking everything for someone he barely New? The answer wasn't simple, but it came from deep in his heart where his most important beliefs lived. Because it's the right thing to do, he called back to her. Because you don't deserve to die for trying to help a sick child. Because sometimes good people have to stand up to bad things even when it's scary. Behind them, the lights of Cedar Ridge grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. But Thomas knew their escape was far from over. When morning came and the townspeople discovered that Li Mei was gone, the hunt would begin in earnest. Sheriff Foster would have no choice but to organize search parties, and every man with a horse would join the chase. Thomas had one advantage. He knew this country better than most people. He had spent years exploring every valley, every canyon, every hidden trail in the area around his ranch. If anyone could keep Li Mei safe until they figured out a permanent solution, it was him. As they rode through a narrow pass between two hills, Li Mei suddenly tensed behind him. "Mr. Thomas," she said urgently, "I hear something. Horses coming fast." Thomas pulled his horse to a stop and listened carefully. In the distance he could hear the unmistakable sound of multiple horses moving at high speed. Either Sheriff Foster had returned to the jail much earlier than expected, or someone else had discovered Li Mei's escape. Either way, they were in serious trouble. "Hold on tight," Thomas told Li Mei, spurring his horse forward. "We're going to have to ride hard if we want to stay ahead of them." The chase that followed was like something out of a nightmare. Thomas pushed his horse to its limits, following trails that were barely visible in the moonlight, taking risks that could have gotten them both killed if his mount had stumbled or missed a step. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer, and Thomas could see torches bobbing in the darkness like angry fireflies. The men chasing them were shouting to each other, coordinating their search and trying to cut off possible escape routes. Thomas recognized some of the voices: Patrick Sullivan, Dr. Harrison, and several other prominent townsmen who had been most vocal about wanting Li Mei executed. "There!" someone yelled from not far behind them. "I saw them go into that canyon." Thomas knew the canyon they were talking about, and he also knew it was a dead end. If they went in there, they would be trapped with nowhere to run. But he also knew something the pursuing men didn't. There was a narrow trail leading out of the canyon that was almost impossible to see unless you knew exactly where to look. "Trust me," he told Li Mei as he guided his horse toward the canyon entrance. "I know a way out that they don't." The canyon walls rose up around them like the sides of a giant's grave, blocking out most of the moonlight and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Thomas had to rely on memory and instinct to find the hidden trail, praying that his horse wouldn't step into a hole or run into a rock wall in the darkness. Behind them, the shouts of their pursuers echoed off the canyon walls, growing louder and more excited as they realized they had their quarry trapped. But Thomas had one last card to play, one final desperate gamble that might save both their lives. Thomas found the hidden trail just as the sound of horses entered the canyon behind them. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst as he guided his horse up the narrow, rocky path that snaked along the canyon wall. The trail was barely wide enough for one horse, and in the darkness, one wrong step could send them tumbling to their deaths on the rocks below. Li Mei held on to him tightly, her face pressed against his back as they climbed higher and higher. She could hear the angry voices of their pursuers echoing from the canyon floor below, growing more frustrated as they realized their prey had somehow vanished into thin air. "Where did they go?" Dr. Harrison's voice boomed through the canyon. "They came in here. There's no way out. Keep looking." Patrick Sullivan shouted back, "They have to be hiding somewhere. That woman is not getting away with what she did to my boy." Thomas and Li Mei reached the top of the canyon just as the first light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon. They were both exhausted from the night's desperate flight, but Thomas knew they couldn't rest yet. His ranch was still 5 miles away, and the men below would eventually figure out the secret trail and continue their pursuit. As they rode across the open prairie toward Thomas's ranch, Li Mei suddenly spoke up with worry in her voice. "Mr. Thomas, what happened when we get to your ranch?" "They still come for me. They still want to hang me." Thomas had been thinking about the same thing. Even if they reached his ranch safely, it would only be a temporary refuge. The angry mob from Cedar Ridge wouldn't give up easily, and eventually they would come looking for both of them. He needed a plan that would end this nightmare once and for all. "I've been thinking about that," Thomas replied as they rode. "We need something that will prove your innocence. Something that will make those men realize they were wrong about you." But what could possibly change the minds of people who were so convinced of Li Mei's guilt? Thomas thought about the evidence that had been presented at the trial. Timothy Sullivan had gotten sick after taking Li Mei's medicine. That was the foundation of the entire case against her. But what if there was another explanation for the boy's illness? When they finally reached the McKenna Ranch, the sun was fully up, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Thomas's ranch hands were already starting their morning chores, and they looked up in surprise when they saw their boss arriving with the Chinese woman who was supposed to have been executed at dawn. Chun, the Chinese worker whom Li Mei had helped months earlier, came running over with concern written all over his face. "Miss Li Mei, what you doing here? Why you not in town?" Li Mei quickly explained what had happened, speaking in Chinese so fast that Thomas couldn't understand a word. But he could see the shock and anger on Chun's face as he heard the story. When Li Mei finished talking, Chun turned to Thomas with tears in his eyes. "Mr. McKenna, this very bad. Miss Li Mei good woman, she helped many people. She never hurt anybody, especially not child." "I know that, Chun," Thomas replied. "But we need to prove it to the people in town. They think she tried to poison Timothy Sullivan with her medicine." Chun's face suddenly lit up with understanding. "But Mr. McKenna, I know what happened." "My cousin? Work for Sullivan family? He tell me Timothy eat bad meat from store 3 days before he gets sick. Meat smell bad, but Mrs. Sullivan cook anyway because she not want waste money." This was exactly the kind of information Thomas had been hoping. FR. If Timothy had eaten spoiled meat before he ever visited Li Mei, that would explain his illness completely. The boy hadn't been poisoned by Chinese herbs. He had been poisoned by rotten food from his own family store. "Chun, can you prove this?" Thomas asked urgently. "Can your cousin testify to what he saw?" Yes, Chun said excitedly. "My cousin very honest man. He tell truth about what he see." Before Thomas could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses. A large group of riders was heading toward the ranch at full speed, and Thomas could see the dust cloud they were kicking up from miles away. The men from Cedar Ridge had finally tracked them down. "Everyone inside the house?" Thomas ordered his ranch hands. "This could get dangerous, and I don't want anyone getting hurt who doesn't have to be." Li Mei looked terrified as she watched the approaching riders. "They come to hang me now," she said quietly. "I sorry I bring trouble to your ranch, Mr. Thomas." "You didn't bring any trouble that wasn't already here," Thomas replied firmly. "The trouble is the hatred and fear in people's hearts. That's not your fault." The mob from Cedar Ridge arrived at the ranch like a thunderstorm, their horses snorting and stamping as the riders pulled them to a halt in front of Thomas's house. There were at least 20 men, all armed and all looking ready for violence. Sheriff Foster was with them, but Thomas could see from his expression that he was trying to keep the situation from getting out of hand. Patrick Sullivan pushed his horse forward, his face red with anger. "McKenna, we know you've got that murderer. Here, hand her over right now, and maybe we'll forget about the fact that you helped a killer escape justice." Thomas stepped out onto his front porch, trying to look calmer than he felt. Li Mei stood behind him, protected by the doorway, but still visible to the angry crowd. Several of the men reached for their guns when they saw her, but Sheriff Foster quickly raised his hand to stop them. "Now hold on, everyone," Foster called out. "Let's not do anything we'll regret later. Thomas, why don't you explain what's going on here?" This was Thomas's chance to present the new evidence, but he knew he had to be careful. These men were on the edge of violence, and one wrong word could turn the situation into a bloodbath. "I'll tell you what's going on," Thomas said in a strong, clear voice that carried to every man in the crowd. "An innocent woman was about to be murdered because you were all too angry and scared to look for the real truth. She poisoned my boy." Patrick Sullivan shouted. Dr. Harrison said so himself. Dr. Harrison was wrong, Thomas replied calmly, and I can prove it. He gestured for Chun to step forward, and the Chinese worker walked nervously onto the porch. The crowd murmured angrily when they saw him, but Thomas held up his hand for silence. Chun here has information about what really made Timothy sick, Thomas announced. Chun, tell them what your cousin saw. Chun's English wasn't perfect, but his message was clear enough. He explained how his cousin had seen Timothy's mother cooking meat that smelled rotten, how the boy had eaten it 3 days before he ever visited Li Mei, and how the timing proved that the herbs had nothing to do with Timothy's illness. At first, the crowd rejected this explanation completely. They shouted Chun down, calling him a liar and accusing him of making up stories to protect Li Mei, but then something unexpected happened. Young man near the back of the crowd spoke up in a hesitant voice. Pa, he might be telling the truth. I remember you saying something about some of the meat in our store going bad last week. It was Timothy's older brother, Robert, and his words hit Patrick Sullivan like a physical blow. The merchant's face went pale as he remembered the conversation his son was referring to. There had been a problem with some beef that had been sitting too long in the summer heat. Patrick had been worried about the financial loss, and his wife had suggested they try to salvage what they could by cooking it thoroughly. Dr. Harrison, who had been so confident in his diagnosis, suddenly looked much less certain. Well, that is to say, food poisoning can sometimes present symptoms similar to what I observed. The mood of the crowd began to shift as doubt crept into their minds. If Timothy had been sick from spoiled meat, then Li Mei's herbs had been trying to cure him, not poison him. The medicine might even have helped him recover faster than he would have otherwise. Sheriff Foster seized the moment to restore order. I think we all need to take a step back and consider what we've learned here, he said in his most authoritative voice. If there's even a chance that we were wrong about this woman, then we need to be very careful about what we do next. But the real turning point came when they heard the sound of another horse approaching at high speed. Everyone turned to see Catherine Sullivan riding toward them as fast as her horse could carry her. She pulled up in front of the crowd with tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of joy, not sorrow. He's awake, she cried out, her voice breaking with emotion. Timothy is awake and asking for food. Dr. Harrison was right. The fever has broken completely. The crowd fell silent as the implications of this news sank in. If Timothy had recovered, then he clearly hadn't been fatally poisoned. Li Mei's herbs hadn't nearly killed him. They might have actually helped save his life. Patrick Sullivan dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward the porch where Li Mei stood. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by shame and confusion. When he reached the steps, he looked up at the woman he had wanted to see hanged just hours earlier. Ma'am, he said quietly, his voice barely audible. I think I owe you an apology. We all do. Li Mei looked down at him with compassion rather than anger. Despite everything these people had put her through, she understood that they had acted out of fear for a child's life, not out of pure evil.